Okay, hi. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar on public policy and human dignity. So, as we all know that our lives are in one way or the other governed by public policies. But do these public policies that we have around respect human dignity? So, in this webinar, we'll explore why dignity should be at the heart of public policy making and how we can create policies that truly serve people. And to have this discussion, I am joined by Professor Erin Daly. She's the founder of Dignity Now, Professor Emerita and Director of the Dignity Rights Clinic and Dignity Law Institute, Widener University, Delaware Law School, and Pro Vice Chancellor of IILM University, Greater Noida, Dr. Nihar Amoncar. Welcome, both of you, and we look forward to this conversation. And thank you so much to everyone who has joined this webinar. Over to you guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashwini. It was something that I was really looking forward to. And Erin, thanks for joining us. What I'm really excited about is this concept of dignity, human dignity that we have talked about. And I'll bring in the cultural context of India, because the very first question sort of hints at the cultural context-based variations. Growing up, I'm sure I can speak here for Dr. Ashwini as well. We had a lot of moral-based education, right? So whether you are in school, whether you are in the family or you're in a social situation, morality has always, been upheld within the Indian society. You should not do this. You should not hurt others' feelings, etc., etc. As I grew up, I always tend to wonder that what went wrong, because if there is so much of moral, education that we got from all different quarters of the society, including our educational institutions, why is it that we are one of the most unhappiest countries? Right? There is no dearth of spirituality in India. You can practice whatever religion you like. You have freedom of speech. You are a democracy. We are not constrained by force. Yet we see people being unhappy. And a large part of it we see in different contexts within large organizations. We see that within large public sector organizations. I just want to get to understand from you. So my first question being is that it is cited as a fundamental principle of governance, human dignity. Yet it is not in many of its contexts, in its true sense, the principle of governance. But is it interpreted differently across the globe, across different legal systems? How do you define the human dignity in the context of public policy?
Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to thank you for organizing this and for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. You raised such interesting questions about dignity and about sort of the work that it can do and the limits of what dignity can do, and bringing into it sort of connecting dignity with morality on the one hand, but then with happiness on the other hand, that it doesn't actually necessarily produce happiness. I think is really interesting, and I would love to explore those issues with you further, but I do want to answer your question. So what's really fascinating to me about, first of all, let me give you a little bit of background about sort of how I come to the concept of dignity, because as you point out, in business, in religion, in all different kinds of ways, people can come to the idea of dignity. I come to it as a constitutional law professor and as somebody who really first started thinking about it when I started reading cases. Actually, the first cases I read were from the Indian Supreme Court that tried to treat people with dignity and tried to infuse the idea of dignity into the constitutional law, even without making it sort of a direct constitutional right, but a way of thinking about what the Constitution is for, what the government is for, what public policy should do. And so I started reading cases from India and then just got curious about whether other courts we're also talking about human dignity because it's not a very strong value in American constitutional law. So I hadn't really seen it before as somebody who had been studying and teaching US constitutional law. What I found when I started looking was that there were cases literally from all over the world, and very importantly, from every legal tradition, civil law, common law, religious law, secular law, but also from every cultural tradition. So there are cases in India that sort of take the idea of dignity and say not only is it a constitutional value, but it's an ancient Vedic value. It's just part of the culture of India. And then there are cases from Pakistan that say it's a Muslim value. And there are cases that say it's a Jewish value, and cases that say it's a Christian value, and cases that say it's a secular value. And you might think that because of this diversity of cultures, all talking about this one word, that it means different things to different people in different cultures. I think that's a very logical thing to assume. What I found in reading the cases is that it's really not true, and that the cases talk about dignity in surprisingly similar ways. And they talk about dignity, frankly, very much in the way the UN Charter talks about dignity, and which is the first sort of international instrument that says in order to end the scourge of war, we have to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and in human dignity. And then the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that and sort of elaborates on the idea of dignity and the way dignity is the foundation of peace and justice and freedom in the world. And from there, and I'm shortening the story a lot, there's a lot of other sort of pieces to it, of course, but the short version is that from there, it sort of spreads out into other human rights instruments, but more importantly, in a way, into the constitutional law of almost every country on earth. And where it's not explicit in the Constitution, it's read into the Constitution by the courts. So in India, you have it in the Constitution, but it's not really a right. But where it's really doing a lot of work in India is in Article 21, right? Where the court is saying that the right to life isn't just the right to not be killed. It's the right to live with dignity. And from that idea, the court has sort of expanded it and grown this idea of dignity in all these different areas, which really reflect sort of the humanity of people.
Yeah.
When I read the cases, I sort of think that what they're really doing is saying what it means to be a human being. What's essential about being a human being? We all want to live with dignity. We all want fundamentally the same things. And that's why I think you don't see a lot of discrepancies in the cases, because human beings want the same things everywhere. Whatever religion they are, whatever culture, whatever language they speak, whatever constitutional history or political history they come from, human beings want to have self-respect. They want to have a life of meaning. They want to be respected by others. They want to be treated decently. They want to live decently. And these are the kinds of things. They want control over their lives. They want control over their bodies. These are the essential things that make us human. And they're the essential things that courts are recognizing everywhere. They're like the fundamentals of dignity. And then you apply it, in your own legal system or political system or whatever. What does that mean in India? What does that mean in Peru?
But that is very
So I
interesting,
think
actually. Yeah.
we get to this sort of essence of it. The definition that I've used is that dignity really stands for the inherent and equal worth of every person. That's my shorthand
Mm.
for this huge, body of law and body of writing about it. But I think that's sort of what it comes down to. And that's directly from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yes, yes. No, I think what you said is spot on. It is quite evident in the legal tenets of the Indian Constitution. But courts being one, I want to stretch the discussion to the other stakeholder that you talked about. It's the political body within the country. Now, it is very difficult, for example, for a country like India or the Indian government with its developing or emerging nation status sometimes to find the fiscal realities to ensure the allocation of the resources for maintaining human dignity is really fruitful. So, for example, we have looked at public-private partnerships happen quite successfully in India in this area, but yet we are not really prioritizing social safety nets. I mean, there's a huge question mark about whether we are implementing, let's say, for example, progressive taxation, whatever it may be. But I'm just thinking, and the question is that how is it that you might have read in your works countries like emerging nations, the E7 nations, how can we manage our fiscal realities better to ensure that, something as important as human dignity is not lost in the chase of the great big hope of the future? Like in India, everybody's running after 2047. They've called it the Viksit Bharat. And we all know about the gentleman who justified a 70-hour work week in order to get that done. So I was just trying to understand when it comes to actually the pragmatism of doing it, to implement it. What are the lessons over there?
I'm a dignity optimist. And so I really believe that it can be done. But to be perfectly honest, there are not, it's very hard to do. And it's not clear what the role of dignity is in the countries that are doing it well. So, and I'm not a political scientist and I don't study that. What I'm interested in, I mean, my background and my focus has been on sort of the first stage of that, which is what are courts saying about dignity, just to get the word out into the public space. So for me, I think it's very important and valuable that the Indian Supreme Court, for instance, talks a lot about dignity. And it's kind of like where you started the conversation about the lessons that were taught and morality and everything. Granted, I don't know how to put this nicely, but of course there are lapses in morality, even though children are taught a certain way, right? So just the same thing with dignity. There are lapses in dignity-based public policies, but nonetheless, it's very important to at least have those lessons in morality that you had as a child and that people have, right? It's important because it gives you the goal and sort of the what's been called the lodestar, the guiding star, if you will. You should act this way. You should try to act this way. And in a way, I think the lessons that you started the conversation with are exactly what the constitutional courts of so many of these countries are doing, especially in India. Of course, the Constitutional Court of India knows that it doesn't have the power to implement dignity-based policies. That's not its job. And it doesn't, and it lives in the reality of India, and it realizes that not everybody is living in perfect comfort and all that kind of stuff. So it's not that the courts are naive about that. It's that the courts are believing that it's important to say, and it's important to not just talk about dignity, but to develop a vocabulary of what dignity means. So some of those things that I said before, these come from the judicial decisions. The courts will talk about, because you have dignity, you have bodily integrity. You just had a major Supreme Court case on the issue of women's bodily integrity. That as a dignity right, as a right to live with dignity, means that you get to control what happens with your body. That you have the right to the full development of the personality. You have a case going back several decades, the Mohini Jain case, about the right to education, about how as a matter of human dignity, people should be able to fully develop their personalities. That's how people grow, develop in themselves and in their community. And education is necessary for that, right? So you have these courts that are not just saying everybody should be treated with dignity, period, but are saying this is what we mean. This is what it means in a given context. And in doing that, it provides policymakers and all others in the society with that same kind of lesson that you got as a child. This is how we should act. This is how we should implement public policy. There's a case I wanted to mention to you from the European Court of Human Rights. It's kind of on an unrelated topic. It has to do with it's a case called Bouygues versus Belgium. And it's a case that is about how a police officer treated two young men. And what the court says in that case, and mistreated them. And what the court says in that case is that even though the police sometimes may assert reasons for mistreating someone, well, we needed to get the information. We needed to have order in the prison. We needed to have security. We needed all these things. There's always these justifications that people have for why they didn't treat somebody with dignity. And what the court says, the European Court of Human Rights says in the Bouygues case, is that dignity is inviolable, and there's never a good reason to deny somebody, to impair somebody's dignity, to harm someone's dignity. And so what they're really saying is that, of course, police, the criminal legal system, the government has good reasons for doing things. They have goals that they absolutely need to accomplish. They need to have order. Sometimes they need to get information. Sometimes they need to, whatever it is, perfectly good reasons. You have to accomplish them without violating a person's dignity. That's one of the reasons why reference to dignity is so important and really different than other constitutional rights. Because dignity, unlike any other right, which comes from the law, gets defined by the law, dignity is inherent. It's inherent in the human person, and it's inviolable because as long as you're human, you have human dignity. And so what the courts are saying, and this is just one example, there's lots of other examples where the courts will talk about the inviolability of human dignity, which means as a practical matter that whatever your policy is, you have to accomplish it without infringing on someone's dignity. And if you can't, then you can't have that policy. Right? If you say the only way I can get this information is to torture this person, you have to make do without the information because dignity is inviolable. So it's this really powerful concept that applies to everything from, torture to education to how people live. And what the courts are saying is that it can never be violated. And again, I just want to go back to what I said. That doesn't make courts naive, right? Yeah. They completely understand. So, and what a lot of courts have done in certain situations is say, it's our job to lay out what the law is, and the law is that you must treat people with dignity. It's your job, government, policymakers, business, whatever. It's your job to figure out how to do that. We're not going to tell you how to do that, but we are going to tell you that you need to use dignity as your guiding principle, and to not let it be sacrificed to some other goal.
No, I think it's very interesting how you put it. I think I'm getting a little bit more clear in terms of how what you just said. It is for the legal system to define it, and they are not going to tell you how to do it, but the purpose why it should be the central composition of how we make policies is quite clearly established in particularly you said the Indian Constitution. I want to bring in the concept of technology in this equation right now, because that's where we are sort of in an area which nobody has really looked at, because the possibilities are just immense. So I remember that when I was working in the UK, the GDPR Act was taken extremely seriously. I mean, I remember being in administration, and probably because I was an Indian as well, I somehow could not get my head around it, that as to why are we so obsessed with these boxes, and this has to be done, that has to be done, this cannot be exchanged, that cannot. So it just stops things from happening. But I do see, then I realize that that it's a very important piece of regulation, because privacy is extremely important, right? If not the most important thing. And we
Right.
are now looking at artificial intelligence. We all know what happened with OpenAI. There's still a lot of gray area over whether they are actually a non-profit or whether some part of it is profit. Where are they getting their data from? And it's happening more and more. And in a country like India, for example, wherein there's just an explosion of these startups working on every single use case of AI, uh, and the general public being quite unaware about what really this means. So, for example, even within the educated people, we see that their understanding of AI can be actually laid down on a continuum from don't know anything to an overconfident person and everything in between. So you cannot get everybody's understanding at the same level. Like, for example, if it's an issue of human dignity, which is otherwise typical to India, for example, caste or religious discrimination, everybody stands on the same page because they have understood this issue, and there's legacy and everything. But AI, we don't know what it is. So how do we actually create a dignity based response to infringement, to data violation, about an entity which is yet to evolve, which we don't know completely? So how does the legal system approach this wherein there's no precedent?
So this is obviously just a huge and fascinating question, and certainly one that I don't think we're going to resolve right now. But because it's so complex, and as you say, in the time it took you to ask the question, more applications of AI have developed, right? I mean, part of the reason there's not as much understanding of it is just because it's happening so fast and we can't keep track. So I think that dignity is a very simple concept, right? And it's a very intuitive concept. When I'm sometimes I'll be in schools and with like little kids, 10 years old or something, and I'll say, do you know what dignity means? And they'll give me a perfectly good response, like it means respect or self-respect or treating other people the way you would want to be treated. Like everybody has an intuitive sense of what it means, because we know how we want to be treated, and we know that we want to feel like we're important and that we matter, right? So in a way, part of what's lovely about dignity, as contrasted with what you're talking about, is that dignity is so simple and reduces down to these very simple ideas that everybody understands. And whether you're talking about AI, which is, obviously a huge and complex thing, other kinds of technologies, biomedical technologies, or on the other hand, like climate change, like there's all these very complicated things going on in the world that we should understand. And I think what dignity does, the role that it plays in those conversations, is to say, when you're going about developing these systems or these technologies or implementing them or whatever it is, you must always keep in mind the human value. A lot of courts around the world sort of tap into something that Immanuel Kant wrote about dignity. And what he wrote, and certainly the way it's been sort of interpreted and absorbed into legal thinking about dignity, is that people should never be treated as a means to an end, but always as an end in and of themselves. And that has had enormous resonance in constitutional law around the world. It's another one of these ideas that seems to transcend culture and region and religion and I think that it's very simple, but it's also a very good rule to keep in mind. If we were to develop technologies with that in mind, if we were to say technologies should be supported that enhance the ability of people to live with dignity. So let's say certain biomedical things, research on diseases, whatever it is, right? Enhance the ability of more people to live with greater dignity. That's great. If you develop a technology that uses human beings, that uses their data, uses their fingerprints, uses their their personal genetic data, that isn't careful about consent, which is a big part of dignity for sort of obvious reasons, that consent is the way we control what happens to our bodies and parts of our bodies and our lives. So you can use the idea of dignity and the values of dignity as a measure. Is this a good policy or is it not? And I think AI technologically is very complicated and raises all kinds of new questions that we haven't thought about before. But from a dignity standpoint, it raises the same questions that anything else raises, which is what kind of world do we want to live in? How do we want to treat each other? Do we want to have some people using other people, or do we want to limit or prevent how much one person can say, what I say matters more than what you say, so I get to control? That's like, a simple example of undignified behavior or violations of dignity is for me to think that because I have more money, I have more power, I have more whatever, that I can control you. That's like, so I think if we use the same rules, the same dignity rules for AI that we want to use for other areas of public policy, we might be able to go far to develop a policy that takes advantage of all the wonderful knowledge that people have, but does it in a way that protects what's most important to human beings.
Yes. No, I think that is so fundamentally, I think that what you are saying is it's the basic fundamental principle that should be at the central point of how we shape the policy. around dignity, no matter what it is. It might be technology, it might be anything. I think that's
Exactly.
just wonderful for you to put it that way
And
because
that,
you simplified the response, because it was that's why it made it very easy to understand. I want
and
to,
that's why
yeah,
courts,
please.
I'm sorry if I can just, but that's exactly why courts around the world have come to that realization. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm channeling what courts are saying. And in all these different contexts, in all these different regions, in all these different constitutional systems, courts are saying exactly the same thing. It has to be at the center. It has to be the guiding principle.
Hmm.
And
Absolutely.
it can't be sacrificed for something else. Sorry, go on.
I think this is a good time to bring in a question from the audience. We have got a question from Aditya. He is asking you, how do we ensure dignity of women in terms of public policy theory from an humanitarian perspective?
Um, uh, I think that so where I see a lot of the dignity work happening is in the courts, and partly that's because that's where I'm looking. And partly that's just because courts, when they write opinions, can write, as you know, sometimes very long opinions, but they're elaborating on ideas, they're telling us things, they're writing the story of how the law should evolve. And but as I said before, they're also very limited in their power. In every country, they're limited in their power. So the fact that a court can render a wonderful decision about the dignity of women um, doesn't mean that the next day women are all living in equality with full autonomy, right? So the courts are maybe in one way of looking at it is like they're setting up the challenge. They're saying, here, people, here, political branches, here, businesses, this is what you should be doing. Can you live up to this? And then it's up to the rest of us in society to make what the courts say real. I want to mention in this context something else that's really interesting about dignity as a legal concept. I mentioned before the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted in 1948. So these are two instruments that are, the UN Charter is 80 years old this year. And they're both instruments that came about, at the very end of World War II, right as World War II was ending or in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And they both focus on dignity as this, not as one of many rights, but as a very central, important, sort of pivotal right. And what they were doing, particularly the drafters of the UDHR, but what they were doing was looking back. I shouldn't say that because actually it's also true of the UN Charter. But what they were doing is looking to history, very, very recent history, but the whole course of human history and looking at war and looking at all kinds of atrocities and saying, we have to change. We can't just keep doing this. And they tried to figure out, how do we get the world to change direction, to say when we have disagreements, we shouldn't be acting through war. We should be acting in other ways to resolve our disagreements. And they settled on the idea of human dignity as performing that transformative work. And a lot of the decisions that I see in courts around the world are doing the same thing. They're using dignity in ways that say, so again, to go back to the recent case in India from just a few days ago about virginity tests.
Yes.
There's a lot of examples of this, but I'll give you an example from 1995 of the European Court of Human Rights. The first case, I think, where the court said that even though the European Convention of Human Rights doesn't mention dignity, dignity is the essence of that convention. It's the essence of human rights. It was a case about marital rape, where a man was prosecuted for raping his wife. And he said, I shouldn't be prosecuted for this. The law for forever has allowed me to act the way I did. So he had history on his side. He probably had precedent on his side. He had culture on his side. And the European Court of Human Rights said, no, as a matter of human dignity, all of that has to be pushed away. Because now we're using human dignity as the linchpin of what justice means, what human rights means, of how people should live and how people should treat each other. And so what you did in the past, okay, but it's not, if it's not consistent with human dignity, the way we understand it now, then it's no longer acceptable. And so dignity in a lot of different contexts, and certainly women's rights is one place where you see this a lot, but a lot of other different contexts where the courts are using dignity precisely to pivot from what has been acceptable in the past to what needs to be respected in the future, in the present and the future. So when India, for instance, talks about its caste system, okay, lots of history, lots of precedent, perfectly consistent with history, but not consistent with an idea of equal human dignity. And so in the new dispensation, it's no longer allowed. The basis for the court's affirmative action jurisprudence and sort of anti-caste jurisprudence is this notion of dignity. So it has the power, and we've seen this in lots of different cases, to transform a society from one that accepted all forms of injustice and indignity to one that no longer does. So I think the question was sort of a practical question and my answer was more theoretical because it's the work of all of us to make the practical changes, but the guiding principle is the theoretical one.
Absolutely. I think the gentleman wanted to understand it from a public policy theory perspective anyway. So again, I think maybe a last question before we can, end this wonderful conversation that we are having. I want you to take I want to take you again to the arena of practice. Now, this might be selfish because people like me and Dr. Ashwini, in the end, we are practitioners, right? So we have to handle people, we have to deal with people. Now, often, not only in our various dialogues with different stakeholders, we have seen that there might be a legal standpoint on human dignity, etc. But it's not, and there are various shapes and forms in which this human dignity is interpreted. Like in business management, we were just talking about, it's called empathy, inclusivity, diversity, right? DEI is quite important nowadays. We also talk about stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder wealth maximization. We talk about responsible management. Now, for me, as an academic, great, more terminologies, so can complicate this thing further. But when it comes to actually practicing it, I see that it sometimes leaves practitioners. I'm not talking about policy making here. Okay, policy making may be at an organizational level. We often fail to challenge anti-dignity behaviors. And
Right.
more so, and the more so because I wouldn't like to put it in a particular cultural context, but it's just a tendency to move on. And just as
Yeah.
you said, that the court, the European Court of Human Rights, was ready to forget about all those initial judgments because it all sort of stems from dignity. We are far away. If you are, if I don't know, Dr. Ashwini might correct me if I'm wrong. I think we are far, far away as a corporate nation to even talk about dignity being the center of how we deal with people. Uh, it- Whether it's with women, I have seen this happen against certain kind of religions. I have seen it happen in cases of transgender applicants in various situations. So my question to you is very much personal now. So you've got two people here with you who I know I can say that want to work towards this cause. We want to build better organizations. We want to build organizations wherein people are happy at work. We want to bring in policies which are actually conducive to the life that people live outside of the organization rather than the ones, the 8 hours that they spend within it. And how is it that we can be a sort of platform for you to enrich your life and live your life to the fullest potential? We are thinking in this direction, but is there any advice you can give us in terms of any best practices, any frameworks that people like us can use to have an impact, maybe at a very micro level, at an organizational level, at a small regional societal level, to move forward this agenda? Is there any advice that you can give us? I mean, there might be people who have joined us in this webinar
Yeah.
who are doing that, small things, but how do we keep going then?
Right. The advice I would give you is keep doing what you're doing. So, I mean, I think that your question answers itself in a way, right? Because you're already talking about, I mean, I think language is important. And so when you talk about empathy, what that's really saying is when we make a policy or a practice, we make a corporate decision, and you talk about stakeholders as opposed to shareholders, right? Stakeholders is a way of recognizing that, of course, shareholders are going to be affected by a corporate decision, but they're not the only ones. The employees, the consumers, the people who live in the places where the company, in the communities, et cetera, the environment, et cetera. There's a lot of different people and things that are, if we want to bring the environment and nature into it, that are affected by any particular corporate decision. So what empathy does is it says, here we are sitting in our boardroom having all this power and we can decide what we want to do, but we should think about how this affects other people. Because they're human beings too, and we are more powerful and richer and all these other things than they are. But ultimately, we're all just equal humans, right? So dignity reminds us of everybody's equality and that everybody matters and everybody has equal worth. So what I say really isn't more important than what somebody not sitting in the boardroom or somebody who's not a shareholder says. So I think you already have the language and the like the goals of dignity, right? To make sure that everybody feels included, to make sure that you don't exclude people. I'll mention just a couple of things quickly. One is theoretical and the other is more practical, I suppose. But the theoretical one is this, and again, it goes back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they were looking at the drafters of that instrument in the Human Rights Commission were looking at, frankly, they were looking at World War II that had just happened at the Nazi policies. And one of the ways that dignity connects to that is that what they saw, and I'm simplifying and I'm not trying to say that other things weren't important, but one aspect of this that I just want to highlight is that they made a decision to vest dignity or to recognize the dignity of individual human beings. every member of the human family, every person is born equal in dignity and rights, rather than some abstraction. What happens when you go beyond the human to the corporate, to the state, to the political ideology, to the religion even? If you say those things have dignity in this way, then those things can sort of subsume the individual. And what they were trying to say is that nothing should subsume the individual dignity. So your company makes a decision and they think, oh, we should put a plant here and it'll actually be really cost effective because we don't have to pay people very much and we can just, not worry about environmental problems. And so it's a really good decision for the company. Shareholders will be happy. And that's putting profits or the goals of the corporation, or however you want to define it, above the individual, the impact on the individual. And the idea of dignity is that the most important thing at the apex of your sort of decision-making scheme should be, how does this affect human beings? And it goes back to the continents and means, it goes back to all those things, but it's just a way of remembering that we need to think about the impact on humans, not the impact of, and only after that do we think about the impact on our bottom line, on our policy goals. We want to get this product out. We have to think about how that's going to affect human beings and their ability to live with dignity. I have a good friend, Donna Hicks, who is a scholar at Harvard University, who's done a lot of work on dignity transnationally, but also specifically in the context of leadership in companies and corporate practices. And she's brought the idea of dignity, which is very much, she talks about it the way I talk about it from law. She talks about it in business that very same way. And talks about dignity as a matter of leadership and as a matter of corporate practice. So there are scholars out there. I don't know if there's a lot of other ones, but I just know her work. There's a lot of thinking, particularly now, when we're thinking about DEI and all these other values, environmental values. There's a lot of thinking about how to bring dignity into corporate practice, into business practice. But I think you've already done that. It's a lot of what you're doing and saying already. It's just a matter of doing it and sort of spreading it.
I think you are absolutely right. It's a matter of going beyond the rhetoric now in India, because we feel the push and pulls of both. While a lot of the companies are pushing for, I wouldn't use the word dignity. It's not something that we read about often now, do we, Ashwini? In India, we are really not really talking about it as much as we should. But there is, as you said, the language that is being spoken. I think it may be the first step in the right direction. But there's a lot of work, as you said, is to be done in terms of, actually implementing and practicing and living what you put in your policy, whether it is an organization, whether it is at the public level, or even within the legal system. I think I have just had a fascinating time. I don't know the last time when the hour flew by. It did not happen quite recently, I can promise you that. But it was fantastic, Erin. Thank you so much. And you answered so clearly and so simply, so that I think it was so easy to understand. Something that can otherwise be so complex. Thank you so much. It was lovely interacting with you, and I hope that we can host you again and take the strands out a little bit further. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a total pleasure. I really appreciate
Thank you.
it. Appreciate
Thank
your
you.
questions. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you in
Thank you.
India.
Same here.
Thank you,
Same here.
Erin and Nihar, for joining us in this important conversation on dignity and public policy. I feel we have truly opened up space for more such important conversations surrounding dignity and public policy. And here we have a couple of my students here attending, and I'm sure they'll take it forward to keep dignity at the heart of every decision that we do, not just in the public policy front, but also in other decisions that we do. So thank you so much for being part of this, and to others who are here, see you next time on the Policy Matters webinar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Pleasure.
Thank you very
Pleasure.
much.
Thanks.
Thank you.